The fifth and final, maybe the most important and probably the most controversial of the theses, the principles that structure the story I'm telling, is I call it the principle of responsible identification. And that's simply this. God takes responsibility for what he permits wicked humans and angelic beings to do. At least he takes responsibility when what they do fits in with an intention of his. There's a lot that we do that he doesn't have a purpose for other than the fact that we need to be free. But when he uses the free decisions of angelic beings or of human beings for a specific purpose, he takes responsibility for it even when it's evil. So let's ask this kind of philosophical question here. Follow me. What does it mean to say God does something? That may seem self-evident to us. Well, God does things the way I do things. You know, I take a drink of water. I do it, so God does it. But it's not quite that simple. You find in the Bible that God does things sometimes in a sense of doing it very directly, a very direct action, like God creates the world. He does that directly. But there's a lot of things, in fact, most things that God does that he doesn't do directly. He does it through mediaries. In fact, there's things that God is said to do which he simply allows for a purpose. So under the direct action, these are like two poles of a spectrum. Under direct action, God creates the world, ex nihilo, from nothing. He does that directly. Another example might be the miracles that Jesus does. Now, even there, God's working through by means of a human being, but he's so identified with this human being that we can, for all intents and purposes, say that God was doing those. So that's direct. God does those things. But on the other side, we have, for example, Jesus' crucifixion. In Isaiah 53, it says that the Father will afflict the Son, bruise the Son, punish the Son. But if you look at how it actually happened, God wasn't directly bringing any kind of punishment on Jesus as though he was mad at Jesus. Over and over again, we read in the New Testament that God gave him over, turned him over to the wicked human beings to do what they wanted to do, and also to wicked principalities and powers. And in doing that, divine Aikido, he turned the evil back on themselves and the whole thing backfired. But he didn't directly do it. He did it by means of allowing these free agents to do what they wanted to do. And he had a specific purpose for it, and yet he takes responsibility for it. He says, I did it. Another example might be Exodus chapter 12. And I want to make it clear here that I'm not at all saying that everything that human beings do is covered by a specific divine purpose at all. Most of what I think we choose to do is, the only purpose for it is that we need to be free. But it's when God owns, takes responsibility for what an agent does, to use it for a particular purpose, that is where you find God claiming to do what these evil agents do. Exodus chapter 12, look at this, it's a very interesting passage. He says, on the one hand, in verse 12, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn. So he's going to do it, right? Then in verse 23, it says, when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, so even there, it looks like God's going to directly do it. He's just going to kill these kids. But it says, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the door frame and will pass over the doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. That's interesting. So apparently it's not God who does the killing, it's the destroyer. And God simply prevents him in the case of those that have the blood over the doorpost, but doesn't prevent him in the case of others. But God doesn't directly do the killing, and yet he says he'll strike them down. He takes responsibility for it. Hebrews 11 says, by faith Moses kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So here again, it's the destroyer that does the killing. And who's the destroyer? According to Revelations 9, he's the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon, which means destroyer. There is an ever-present force of darkness that will destroy in every opportunity. If God ever stops keeping him at bay, well then there's death. He's been a murderer from the beginning. That's why Hebrews 2:14 says he's the Lord of all death. God merely allows things, and yet he often identifies himself as the agent doing that for a variety of reasons. One has to do with the ancient conception of God as an ancient monarch king who sort of is over the whole empire, and the whole empire is an extension of him. That's one reason. But ultimately, I think it's because God takes responsibility for all the suffering in his creation. And in doing that, here again, God is anticipating Calvary. He's always this incarnational God. On the cross, Jesus Christ takes responsibility for the sin of the world. On the cross, he enters into our guilt and our sin and suffers the inevitable consequences of that sin. And we see that anticipated in the way God takes responsibility for the ugly way that people project onto him things that evil people do. Some folks, as they read, they notice how God and other agents both are assigned the same verbs. They're both said to do the same evil activity. And so some folks says, well, okay, God must be controlling the evil agents. And that's how come the authors say God does it, but also the destroyer does it, and things of that sort. The trouble with that view is that, on the one hand, God can't do evil. He's altogether good. He doesn't do evil. Also, the text doesn't say that God caused the destroyer to kill the firstborn. It doesn't say that. It says he allowed the destroyer to kill the firstborn. If God's ideal world were still intact, there wouldn't be a destroyer and there wouldn't be anyone killing firstborns. But most of all, I think it's because God holds agents responsible for what they do. It shows that he's not controlling them. For example, you read the Old Testament and it's very clear that God punished Israel through Assyria and Babylon. He even says, I will destroy you by means of Assyria and by means of Babylon. But then he turns around and punishes Assyria and Babylon for doing what they did. He punishes them because of their pride and because of their violence. Clearly, he's not controlling them. He holds them responsible for what they do. They shouldn't have been the kind of nations that would have done that sort of thing in the first place. An even more interesting passage is when God punished the Babylonians for doing more violence than he anticipated. Zechariah 1:15, it says, I was only a little angry, said the Lord, but because of their excessive violence, he says, you've added to the calamity. Yeah, I withdrew. I knew you were going to come in here and do the slaughtering, but you went way beyond what I intended. And so he punishes them for that. So clearly he's not micro-controlling them. They're still free agents. It's just that God has withdrawn and allowed them to do what they wanted to do. You find that kind of parallel going all over the place. Yahweh is said to afflict Job, and so the friends comfort Job for the afflictions that the Lord brought on him. But if you read the narrative, Yahweh simply allowed Satan to afflict Job. In fact, he says to Satan, everything that he has is in your power. And Satan has to go out from the presence of the Lord to do this malevolent work that he wants to do. When God forges this covenant with Israel, you find all these blessings and all these cursings. And part of the cursing is that he says, if you disobey me, in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, he says, I will ruin you and destroy you. Okay, so there it's the Lord that's going to do it. You read the same covenant 3 chapters later as he's talking to Moses. And he says, if they disobey me, I'm going to become angry and I'll forsake them. I will hide my face from them and they will be destroyed. Many disasters and calamities will come on them. And in that day they'll ask, have not these come on us because our God is not with us? And I will certainly hide my face in that day. So here, he says, I will destroy you, but it's clearer from the context. He's simply saying, I'm not going to protect you. And yet he takes responsibility by saying, I will do that. Later on with the Babylonians, the Lord says he's going to destroy the Israelites. And here's a classic case of him being expressed as an ancient Near Eastern God. He says, I will smash them one against the another, parents and children alike, declares the Lord. He's going to take kids and parents and smash their heads together. I will allow no pity or mercy or compassion to keep me from destroying them. It's hard to imagine a picture of God more antithetical to the picture that we're given in Jesus Christ. But see, here's what we need to understand, that he's taking on the ugliness, he's playing the role of what the people need at that time as they're staying in relationship with him. You want to play ferocious ancient warrior? God will play that. But what's really going on? Well, you read it in context. You find him saying things like this. I will give Zedekiah, king of Judah, his officials and the people in this city into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and to their enemies who seek their lives. He will put them to the sword. He will show them no mercy or pity or compassion. In fact, you find, especially in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, many of the same vicious, violent, barbaric verbs that God applies to himself are also applied to Nebuchadnezzar and the warriors of Assyria and Babylon. And when we read these in the light of Christ, we've got to see behind the whole thing this crying God. Final question is, how do you know then? Here's the spectrum. God does it. The Bible says God does it. How do we know whether he's actively doing it directly or whether he's simply allowing it with a grieving heart for a specific purpose? And the answer I submit to you is this. Our chief criteria for distinguishing between what God actively does and what God merely allows has got to be Jesus Christ. This is what God really looks like. So when we look at the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, a lot of the stuff that says God did, I believe we're justified in saying he didn't really do it. He had a grieving heart for a specific purpose. He allowed it. You have to hear the wailing God behind it, but he doesn't himself engage in violence. I don't know in fact, I know that this does not answer all the questions. There's a lot of questions that left remaining, especially the abbreviated version I gave it here. I don't know if this is adequate to explain all episodes of divine violence, that God's just merely pulling back and letting cosmic forces or human agents do violence. But I think it's at least a move in that direction. It's at least, I think, a plausible heuristic grid, an interpretive grid, by which we can begin to study the Old Testament and ask the question, okay, we see our wife, lovely wife, kicking the vet over when we know she's a loving person. What else might be going on? Well, I think this gives us a clue. Something else is going on. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Let's collect questions, and then we'll come back and address as many of those questions as possible.